There are places where the earth opens its mouth and swallows time whole, places where the surface world, with its seasons and its certainties, simply ceases to matter. In the darkness below, something older waits, something that should not be there at all. Imagine standing at the threshold of a cavern mouth, the last threads of daylight fading behind you, the air growing cooler with every step forward, heavy with the mineral breath of stone that has not seen the sun in millennia. The walls narrow, the ceiling descends, and then, in the dancing cone of a flashlight beam, something emerges from the rock that stops the breath in your chest. A horse, frozen mid-gallop, its mane streaming, its eye alive with terror or ecstasy or something beyond human naming. Beside it, lions prowl in silent procession. Rhinoceroses clash with lowered horns. A panther snarls. An owl turns its flat, knowing face toward you across an abyss of 40,000 years. This is Chauvet. This is where the story begins. But it does not end here, not by any measure. For Chauvet is merely one chamber in a vast subterranean library that stretches across continents and confounds every comfortable narrative we have constructed about who we were, what we knew, and when we knew it. From the painted galleries of southern France to the carved caverns of eastern China, from the 18 levels of an underground city in Turkey to the crystal palaces of northern Mexico, the deep places of the earth hold secrets that refuse simple explanation. They whisper of capabilities that should not have existed, of intentions we cannot fathom, of knowledge that appeared, flourished, and then vanished without a trace. What compelled our ancestors to descend into absolute darkness, to crawl through passages barely wide enough for a human body, to spend hours or days or perhaps weeks in the belly of the earth? What drove them to leave their marks in places no sunlight would ever touch? Places that seem designed not for the living eye, but for something else entirely, something we have perhaps forgotten how to see. And what happened to the techniques, the traditions, the understanding that made such feats possible? These are the questions that wait in the dark, and there are no easy answers to be found. Settle in. Let the surface world recede. We are going down. The story of Chauvet d'Arc begins, as so many great discoveries do, with a gust of air. On December 18, 1994, 3 amateur cavers named Jean-Marie Chauvet, Eliette Brunel, and Christian Hilaire were exploring the limestone cliffs above the Ardèche River in southern France. The region was known for its caves, hundreds of them riddling the pale rock like the burrows of ancient creatures. But most had been explored, catalogued, dismissed. The cavers were looking for something new, following the faintest movement of air rising from a blocked passage, a breath from below that suggested a larger space hidden behind centuries of accumulated debris. What they found, after clearing a narrow opening and squeezing through a passage that dropped into darkness, was a gallery of such staggering beauty and age that it would rewrite the story of human creativity. The walls were alive with images, not the crude scratches and simple outlines that archaeologists had come to expect from the earliest periods of human art, but fully realized compositions of astonishing sophistication. Horses rendered with 3-dimensional shading, lions depicted in sequences that suggested movement, almost animation, rhinoceroses overlapping in ways that created the illusion of depth, of a herd receding into the stone itself. The technical mastery was immediately apparent even to untrained eyes. The artists had used the natural contours of the cave walls to give their subjects volume, placing a bison's shoulder where the rock bulged outward, setting a mammoth's belly along a concave depression. They had employed stumping, the deliberate smearing of charcoal to create gradations of tone. They had scraped away portions of the soft limestone to create highlights, to make surfaces gleam. They had even, in several instances, engraved preliminary sketches before applying pigment, a practice that would not become standard in Western art for tens of thousands of years. When the radiocarbon dates came back, the archaeological community struggled to process what they were being told. The oldest images in Chauvet were approximately 36,000 years old. Some pushed back even further, toward 40,000 years before the present. This was not merely old, this was older than the last Ice Age maximum, older than the migration of modern humans across the Bering Land Bridge, older than every pyramid, every megalith, every bronze sword, every clay tablet, every written word that has ever been deciphered. The artists of Chauvet worked their magic in a world where woolly mammoths and cave lions still roamed Europe in great numbers, where the Neanderthals had only recently vanished from the Earth, where the very concept of civilization lay more than 30 millennia in the unimaginable future. Mainstream archaeology interprets Chauvet as a ritual space, a sanctuary where Upper Paleolithic humans gathered to perform ceremonies whose exact nature remains opaque, but whose general outlines can be surmised from ethnographic parallels with modern hunter-gatherer societies. The animals depicted, according to this interpretation, represent totemic figures, spirit helpers, or perhaps the quarry of symbolic hunts enacted in the darkness. The location deep within the earth, far from any habitation site, suggests a deliberate separation from the profane world of daily survival, a descent into a liminal realm where the boundaries between human and animal, living and dead, became permeable. The sophistication of the art, while surprising, is explained as the product of a long tradition of artistic development that simply failed to survive in the archaeological record of earlier periods. We are seeing, the consensus holds, not the beginning of human art, but merely the oldest examples that happen to have been preserved in the protective environment of a sealed cave. Yet certain aspects of Chauvet continue to invite deeper reflection. Consider the question of light. The galleries of Chauvet extend more than 400 meters into the mountain. The deepest chambers lie in absolute darkness, untouched by even the faintest glimmer of daylight. The artist would have worked by the flickering illumination of torches or animal fat lamps, tools that have been found scattered throughout the cave floor. But here is the puzzle. The images show no signs of the fumbling, the hesitation, the trial and error that one might expect from work executed under such challenging conditions. The lines are confident, flowing, executed with a sureness that suggests either extensive practice or a kind of vision that transcended the physical limitations of the working environment. How did artists working in near-total darkness, with their faces inches from the rock, maintain such a clear conception of the overall composition? How did they avoid the smudging, the overpainting, the awkward proportions that plague even trained artists working in well-lit studios? Some researchers have noted that many of the images seem designed to respond to flickering light, to come alive when viewed by torchlight rather than the steady illumination of modern photography. The overlapping figures, which can seem chaotic in static images, resolve into sequences of movement when a flame dances across them. The shadows cast by the natural rock formations become part of the composition, defining edges and creating depth that vanishes under electric light. Were the artists of Chauvet working with an understanding of light and shadow, of perception and illusion, that we have only begun to appreciate? Were they creating not static images, but something closer to cinema, to animation, to a technology of visual storytelling that exploited the unique properties of firelight in ways we are still learning to decode? And then there is the question of acoustics. Researchers studying the cave have discovered that the most elaborate panels of imagery tend to cluster in areas with unusual acoustic properties, chambers where sound resonates and amplifies in striking ways. Speak in certain spots and your voice returns transformed, deepened, multiplied into a chorus. Strike the walls and they ring almost like drums, the limestone vibrating with a sonority that seems designed rather than accidental. Did the artists choose these locations because of their sound? Were the images intended to be experienced not in silence but accompanied by chanting, by singing, by rhythms beaten on the living rock? And if so, what songs were sung in these halls? What knowledge was transmitted in darkness, preserved not on the walls but in the memories of those who gathered there, a tradition that has long since faded into silence? The animals themselves pose their own mysteries. The Chauvet artist showed a marked preference for dangerous creatures, for predators. Lions predominate, rendered with an attention to detail that suggests intimate familiarity. Cave bears, rhinoceroses, mammoths, aurochs with their sweeping horns. These were not the primary prey species of Upper Paleolithic hunters, not the reindeer and horses and bison that filled their bellies and clothed their bodies. These were the creatures that hunted humans, that competed with them, that killed them. Why this fascination with the dangerous, the powerful, the terrifying? Was it an attempt to propitiate these spirits, to claim their power, to understand them in some way that might offer protection? Or was it something else entirely? A relationship with the animal world that we, in our domesticated modernity, can no longer comprehend? One cannot help but notice the hands. Scattered throughout the cave, on panels otherwise dominated by animal figures, human hands appear in negative, silhouettes created by placing a palm against the rock and blowing pigment around it. Some are complete, some are missing fingers, whether through accident, disease, or deliberate amputation remains unclear. They reach across the millennia, these hands pressing against the membrane between their time and ours as if trying to push through. Were they signatures, marking the presence of individual artists? Were they ritual gestures, sealing some compact with the spirits of the deep? Were they messages, meant for those who would come after? A simple declaration that we were here, we existed. We touched this stone in darkness and our mark remains. The cave was sealed approximately 20,000 years ago when a rockfall closed its entrance, preserving the interior in a state of near-perfect suspension. The footprints of cave bears still dimple the clay floors. The bones of creatures extinct for hundreds of centuries still rest where they fell. The charcoal from ancient torches still lies in scattered heaps, waiting to yield its secrets to radiocarbon analysis. But when the seal broke, when the first modern humans entered in 1994, they brought with them more than flashlights and cameras. They brought a fundamental incomprehension, a gulf of understanding that 40,000 years had opened between the makers of these images and those who would finally see them again. We can marvel at the technique, we can analyze the pigments, we can date the charcoal and map the chambers and write scholarly papers about the probable function of the space. But we cannot truly know what happened here. The knowledge, the context, the living tradition that gave these images their meaning has vanished utterly. Like so many things from the deep past, like so many techniques and traditions that seem to appear fully formed, flourish briefly, and then disappear without successors or explanation. The Stone Age did not end because we ran out of stone, but somewhere along the way we stopped remembering how to use it. Our journey now shifts eastward, across continents and oceans, to islands that seem impossibly remote from the limestone galleries of France. And yet what waits there suggests that whatever moved through Chauvet was not unique, not isolated, not the singular achievement of one remarkable population. Something was stirring in the deep places of the human mind, something that expressed itself in darkness, in stone, in images that would wait tens of thousands of years for someone to find them again. The caves of Sulawesi rise from the tropical lowlands of Indonesia like the bones of some vast creature half buried in the jungle. For centuries, local populations knew of the shelters and overhangs that riddled the karst limestone, using them as refuges from rain, as burial sites, as places of temporary habitation. But what lay deeper in the stone, in chambers accessible only through narrow fissures and flooded passages, remained unknown until researchers began systematic exploration in the early 20th century. What they found would eventually rewrite the entire history of human artistic achievement. In 2014, a team of archaeologists led by Maxime Aubert published dates for the cave art of Sulawesi that sent shockwaves through the academic world. Using a technique called uranium-thorium dating, which measures the decay of radioactive elements in the thin layer of calcium carbide that forms over cave paintings, they determined that some of the images were at least 40,000 years old. One figure, a simple outline of a babirusa, a pig deer native to the island, dated to approximately 45,000 years before the present. A nearby hand stencil proved even older, pushing back beyond the limits of the technique's reliability, suggesting an age that might approach, or even exceed 50,000 years. This was not supposed to be possible. The conventional narrative of human artistic development had placed its origins firmly in Europe, in the caves of France and Spain, in populations of anatomically modern humans who had migrated westward and developed their creative capacities in the challenging environment of Ice Age Europe. Sulawesi was supposed to be a backwater, a stepping stone on the migration route to Australia, passed through quickly and forgotten. The people who lived there during the Upper Paleolithic were not supposed to have been painting anything. They were certainly not supposed to have been painting things that were older than Chauvet. The implications rippled outward. If artistic traditions of comparable sophistication existed simultaneously in Western Europe and Southeast Asia, separated by thousands of miles and connected by no known cultural contact, then either the capacity for such art had developed independently in multiple populations, a striking case of convergent evolution, or it had been carried out of Africa by the common ancestors of both groups, meaning that its true origins lay even deeper in the human past than anyone had imagined. The painted caves were not the beginning of human art, They were merely the oldest surviving fragments of a tradition that might stretch back to the very emergence of our species, perhaps further. Mainstream archaeology has generally embraced the first interpretation, arguing that the cognitive capacity for symbolic thought and artistic expression was present in all anatomically modern humans from at least 100,000 years ago, manifesting whenever populations encountered suitable surfaces and settled long enough to develop local traditions. The simultaneous appearance of cave art in distant regions reflects not cultural transmission, but the shared heritage of a species equipped with the same mental toolkit. The caves of Sulawesi and Chauvet are parallel developments, independent expressions of a universal human impulse. Yet certain features of the Sulawesi art continue to provoke questions that this framework struggles to answer. Consider the hand stencils. They appear in both regions, executed using identical techniques. A hand placed flat against the rock, pigment blown around it to create a negative image. The pigments differ according to local availability. Ochre in France, mulberry-derived reds in Sulawesi, but the concept, the execution, the placement are remarkably consistent. Some of the Sulawesi hands, like some at Chauvet, appear to be missing fingers. Were these populations, separated by hemispheres, independently arriving at the same ritual practice? Were they both drawing on a tradition so ancient that it predated their divergence? Or is there some deeper pattern at work, some compulsion inherent to the human encounter with darkness and stone that produces the same gestures again and again? The animals depicted pose their own puzzles. At Sulawesi, the artists painted babirusa, wild pigs, and a diminutive bovid called an anoa. These were local creatures, known to the populations that inhabited the island. But the style of representation, the conventions of outline and perspective, the rendering of movement through the overlapping of figures, these show striking parallels to the European tradition. Were these artistic techniques developed independently, arriving at similar solutions to similar problems? Or was there some template, some fundamental grammar of visual representation that expressed itself consistently wherever humans first put pigment to stone? And then there is the question of access. Many of the painted panels in Sulawesi, like those in Chauvet, lie deep within cave systems, reachable only through difficult passages that would have required significant effort to navigate. The artist did not paint in the convenient overhangs and shelters that dot the landscape. They pushed deeper into the darkness, into spaces that offered no practical advantage and considerable risk. What drew them there? What made the deep chambers sacred, or necessary, or irresistible? And how did they light their work in a tropical environment where the animal fat lamps of Ice Age Europe would not have been the obvious solution? The caves of Sulawesi hold another secret that researchers are only beginning to investigate. The acoustic properties of the painted chambers, though less thoroughly studied than those of European sites, show preliminary indications of similar patterns. The spaces chosen for the most elaborate imagery tend to be those with unusual resonance, with natural amplification, with qualities that would have transformed any sound made within them. Were these spaces chosen for their voices? Were the paintings intended to be sung to, chanted over, activated by sound in ways we no longer remember how to perform? What we do know is that the tradition, whatever its origins, did not survive. The painted caves of Sulawesi were eventually abandoned, their entrances forgotten, their images left to the slow work of calcium deposits and mineral seepage. The knowledge of their making, the rituals that accompanied their creation, the meanings that their makers would have recognized instantly, all of this has vanished as completely as if it had never existed. We can date the pigments, we can analyze the composition, we can marvel at the antiquity. But the living context is gone, and gone absolutely. The caves remember, but we have forgotten how to listen. From the tropical karst of Southeast Asia, our journey descends now into something different, something that defies the categories of art and ritual that served us in Chauvet and Sulawesi. We move from images painted on natural surfaces to stone cut by human hands, shaped with a precision and scale that seems to belong to a different order of achievement entirely. We enter the Longyou caverns. In 1992, a farmer in Zhejiang province, China, decided to drain a pond that had occupied his village as long as anyone could remember. Local legend held that the pond was bottomless, that strange things had been glimpsed in its dark waters, that it was best left undisturbed. But drought had made the water valuable, and modern pumps made the draining feasible, and so the farmer set to work. What emerged as the water level dropped was not the muddy bottom he expected, but the entrance to a chamber. A vast chamber. A chamber that had been carved, deliberately and systematically, from the living rock. Over the following years, as exploration continued, the true scope of the discovery became apparent. The single chamber revealed by the first draining was merely one of at least 36 similar caverns, each carved from the same sandstone bedrock, each showing the same characteristic chisel marks covering every surface, each filled over the millennia by groundwater that had preserved them from collapse and hidden them from history. The smallest of the caverns covers several hundred square meters. The largest exceeds 50,000. Together they represent the extraction of approximately 1 million cubic meters of rock, an effort that would have required, by some estimates, 1,000 workers, labouring continuously for 6 years. There is no historical record of their creation. No dynasty claims them. No chronicle mentions them. No legend before the 20th century draining operations suggests that anyone knew they were there. The date of their construction remains uncertain, with estimates ranging from the 3rd century BCE to as early as the Han Dynasty, but no datable artifacts have been recovered from the sealed chambers, and the stone itself resists the techniques that work for organic materials. They are, in the most literal sense, a mystery carved in rock. Mainstream archaeology interprets the Longyou caverns as likely quarries or water storage facilities, created by organised labour during one of China's periods of strong central authority. The sophisticated drainage systems visible in some chambers suggest engineering knowledge consistent with the hydraulic achievements of ancient Chinese civilization. The scale of the undertaking, while impressive, is not unprecedented when compared to other massive construction projects of the imperial era. The absence of historical records is explained by the loss of archives, the displacement of populations, the simple forgetting that occurs when a project is completed and its purpose fulfilled. Yet certain aspects of the caverns continue to resist this practical interpretation. Consider the chisel marks. Every surface in the Longyou caverns, walls, ceilings, pillars, floors, is covered with parallel grooves left by the tools that carve them. These grooves are remarkably uniform, spaced approximately 60 centimeters apart, angled at a consistent 60 degrees, extending for hundreds of meters without deviation. They give the chambers the appearance of having been combed rather than chiseled, as if some enormous implement had been dragged systematically across every accessible surface. But how? The chambers are irregular in shape, following natural contours in some places, defying them in others. The pillars left to support the ceilings required work from multiple angles. The ceilings themselves, some rising 30 meters overhead, would have demanded scaffolding or suspension systems of considerable sophistication. How did the workers maintain such consistency across such varied surfaces? Why did they bother? If the caverns were quarries, the extracted stone should appear somewhere. 1 million cubic meters of sandstone represents an enormous quantity of building material, enough to construct multiple large structures or extensive fortifications, yet no corresponding structures have been identified in the region. The stone, if it was used, has vanished without trace, its destination as mysterious as its origin. If the caverns were water storage facilities, their design seems inefficient, with irregular shapes that would have complicated distribution and maintenance. And the chisel marks, which would have weakened the stone and provided surfaces for algae and mineral growth, seem counterproductive for a purely hydraulic purpose. The acoustic properties of the chambers add another layer to the puzzle. Sound behaves strangely in the Longyou caverns, resonating and echoing in ways that vary from chamber to chamber, but that share a common quality of amplification and transformation. Whispers carry across distances that should render them inaudible. Certain tones produce harmonics that seem to come from the stone itself, as if the walls were singing along. Were these effects intentional? Were the caverns designed not merely to store water or provide building material, but to function as sonic environments, as spaces where sound itself was part of the purpose? One cannot help but feel, standing in those chambers, that the conventional explanations miss something essential. The scale is too vast for mere utility. The precision is too consistent for mere labour. The absence of any historical memory is too complete for mere forgetting. The Longyou caverns feel intentional in a way that transcends the practical, as if their creation was a statement, a demonstration, a proof of capability that needed no audience beyond the makers themselves. But if so, what were they proving? And to whom? The knowledge required to create them, whatever it was, did not survive. No tradition of cavern carving continued in the region. No techniques were passed down, no apprentices trained, no texts written to preserve the methods for future generations. Like so many achievements of the ancient world, the Longyou caverns represent a flowering of capability that appeared, accomplished its purpose, and vanished. The chisel marks remain, covering every surface with their mute testimony. But the hands that held the chisels, the minds that directed them, the understanding that made such work possible, all of this has faded into a silence deeper than the stone itself. We descend now from carved chambers to carved cities, from the mysteries of intention to the mysteries of survival. Our journey takes us to the heart of Anatolia, to a landscape of soft volcanic rock that has been shaped by human hands for thousands of years, to a place where the earth opens into depths that should not exist. We enter Derinkuyu. The underground city was discovered, according to local legend, when a man renovating his home broke through a wall and found a passage leading into darkness. The passage led to a chamber. The chamber led to another passage. The passages multiplied, branching and descending, until it became clear that what lay beneath the surface was not a cellar or a storage room, but an entire subterranean complex, a city carved from the soft, tough stone, extending 18 levels into the earth, capable of sheltering an estimated 20,000 people, along with their livestock and supplies. Mainstream archaeology dates the oldest portions of Derinkuyu to approximately the 8th century BCE, attributing the initial construction to the Phrygians, an ancient Anatolian people known for their skill in working the local stone. Subsequent expansions are credited to early Christians who used the underground spaces as refuges during periods of persecution, and to Byzantine populations fleeing Arab invasions in later centuries. The city's depth and complexity are explained as the accumulated product of generations of enlargement, each population adding to what their predecessors had begun, until the original modest refuge had grown into a vast subterranean warren. The engineering that made such depth possible is impressive but not inexplicable. The soft, tough stone of the region, deposited by ancient volcanic eruptions, is easy to carve when freshly exposed but hardens upon contact with air, providing natural structural reinforcement. Ventilation shafts extending from the surface to the deepest levels supplied fresh air through natural convection. Rolling stone doors, carved in place and weighing hundreds of kilograms, could be rolled across passages from the inside, sealing the city against intruders while remaining impossible to force from outside. Water channels and wells provided access to the water table. Storage rooms, stables, chapels, schools and living quarters provided everything necessary for extended habitation beneath the ground. Yet certain features of Derinkuyu continue to provoke speculation that transcends the conventional narrative. The depth is difficult to explain through gradual expansion alone. 18 levels represents a vertical extent of approximately 85 meters, a significant engineering achievement that would have required careful planning from the outset rather than ad hoc additions. The ventilation system, which must function consistently throughout the entire complex, suggests a holistic design rather than piecemeal growth. The rolling stone doors, which are too heavy to have been moved into position after the passages were carved, indicate that defense was a primary consideration from the earlier stages of construction. Were the Phrygians, in the 8th century BCE, really planning for an underground city of this scale and sophistication? Or were they expanding and improving something that already existed? Some researchers have noted that the chisel marks on the oldest levels differ in character from those on later editions, suggesting either different tools or different techniques. The oldest carvings show a consistency and precision that rivals the work of much later periods, as if the initial builders possessed capabilities that subsequent occupants struggled to match. The earliest chambers also show features that serve no obvious practical purpose. Niches too small for storage, carvings too abstract for decoration, passages that lead nowhere and serve no evident function. Were these remnants of an original design whose meaning had been lost by the time later populations arrived? Were the Christians and Byzantines not expanding a Phrygian refuge but rediscovering and adapting something far older? The acoustics of Derinkuyu add another dimension to these questions. Sound travels strangely in the underground city, amplified in some chambers, deadened in others, channeled along passages in ways that sometimes seem accidental and sometimes seem deliberate. Communication between levels, which would seem impossible given the depth, becomes feasible through certain shafts and openings that function almost like speaking tubes. Were these features intentional? Were they designed to allow coordination across the vast vertical extent of the complex? Or are they simply the accidental byproducts of the city's irregular geometry? One cannot stand in the deepest chambers of Derinkuyu surrounded by stone that human hands carved more than 2 millennia ago, without sensing that something essential has been lost. The city functions. Its engineering is sound, its defensive features are ingenious, but its meaning, the understanding that guided its creation, the knowledge that made its builders confident that such a project was possible and worthwhile, this has vanished as completely as the populations that once sheltered in its depths. The city remains, the civilization that created it does not, and in that gap between the enduring stone and the vanished knowledge, the mystery persists. Our descent continues deeper now, into territory where the mysteries multiply beyond the merely archaeological. We leave the old world behind and cross an ocean to a place where the jungle swallows everything, where rivers emerge from the earth already ancient, where the caves hold secrets that have never been satisfactorily explained. We enter the Cueva de los Tallos. The cave takes its name from the oil birds, tallos in Spanish, that nest in its upper chambers. Located in the eastern foothills of the Ecuadorian Andes, it plunges into the earth through a vertical entrance that drops nearly 90 meters before opening into a vast network of passages and chambers extending for kilometers in multiple directions. The indigenous Shuar people have known of the cave for centuries, considering it a sacred space, a threshold between worlds, a place where the spirits of ancestors and the powers of the earth could be accessed by those who dared to descend. Western awareness of the Cueva de los Tallos came primarily through the controversial claims of Erich von Däniken and the explorer Juan Moritz, who alleged in the 1970s that the cave contained a vast library of metal tablets inscribed with the records of an advanced ancient civilization. According to these claims, the tablets had been glimpsed by Moritz during earlier explorations and represented evidence of a lost culture that had flourished in the Amazon basin before the rise of any known civilization. The story attracted sufficient attention that a major expedition was organised in 1976, led by Scottish engineer Stan Hall and including among its participants the astronaut Neil Armstrong. The expedition found no metal library. The chambers it explored, while impressive in scale and containing archaeological materials, including pottery fragments and human remains, yielded no evidence of the advanced civilization that Moritz had described. The metal tablets, if they ever existed, were not located. The expedition was widely reported as a failure, a debunking, a cautionary tale about the dangers of chasing pseudo-archaeological fantasies into the jungle. The Cueva de los Tallos faded from public attention, remembered mainly as an embarrassment. Yet certain features of the cave continue to resist such easy dismissal. The architecture of the passages is difficult to explain through natural geological processes alone. Many chambers show remarkably flat floors, smooth walls, and regular dimensions that seem more consistent with deliberate carving than with the action of water on limestone. The main corridor, which extends for nearly 500 meters, maintains a width and height that varies little along its entire length, as if cut to a specification. The ceilings, in several chambers, show what appear to be tool marks, parallel grooves similar in character though not identical to those found in the Longyou caverns. Were these passages shaped by human hands, and if so, by whom, and when, and why? The Shuar traditions regarding the cave add another layer of complexity. They speak of the cave as a place of transformation, a threshold where shamans could communicate with the anaconda spirit and receive knowledge from the depths of the earth. They describe rituals performed in the darkness, ceremonies involving sound and breath and substances that altered perception. They speak of a time before time, when beings from elsewhere dwelt in the earth and taught the first humans the skills they needed to survive. Are these myths simply the product of imagination, the universal human tendency to populate the unknown with meaning? Or do they preserve, in degraded form, memories of something that actually occurred? The acoustic properties of the main chambers have never been systematically studied, but casual observers have noted that sound behaves strangely in the depths, amplifying and distorting in ways that can be disorienting. The darkness is absolute, the silence profound when one stops moving. The sensory deprivation is intense enough to induce hallucinations in even healthy individuals after prolonged exposure. Were the rituals the Shuar described designed to exploit these properties? Were the caves used as sensory deprivation chambers, as spaces where altered states could be reliably induced? And what might have been experienced in those states? The metal library remains officially unconfirmed. No subsequent expedition has produced the tablets that Moritz described, yet the claims have never been entirely put to rest. Researchers continue to investigate, amateur expeditions continue to descend, and the possibility that something remains hidden in the unexplored reaches of the vast cave system refuses to die. The cave is enormous, its passages extending beyond the limits of any single expedition's capability to explore. What waits in the darkness that has not yet been reached? What might lie beneath the floors that have not yet been excavated? What knowledge, if any, persists in the memories of the Shuar who have kept the caves sacred for generations? The questions multiply in the dark, the answers remain elusive, and the cave waits, as it has waited for millennia, for someone patient enough or foolish enough to seek what it may or may not contain. Our final descent takes us to a place where the very possibility of life seems to approach its limits, where the deep earth reveals not the achievements of ancient humans, but the achievements of something far stranger. We leave behind the caverns carved by hands, the galleries painted by torchlight, and enter a realm where the crystals themselves have become cathedrals, where biology has done what geology should not permit, where the silence holds secrets that science is only beginning to whisper. We enter Nika. The Cave of the Crystals was discovered in the year 2000, when miners drilling for lead and zinc in the mountains of Chihuahua, Mexico, broke through into a chamber that should not exist. The temperatures inside exceeded 50 degrees Celsius. The humidity approached 100%. The air was unbreathable without protection, lethal within minutes to an unequipped human body. And rising from the floor, extending across the space in every direction, enormous crystals of selenite glowed in the miners' lamps like the bones of some impossible creature, some architecture of another world entirely. The crystals are the largest ever found on Earth. The biggest measures nearly 12 meters in length and weighs an estimated 55 tons. They formed over approximately 500,000 years, growing slowly in the superheated water that filled the chamber before it was accidentally drained by mining operations. They are composed of gypsum, one of the most common minerals on the planet, but their scale and perfection exceed anything that geology had predicted was possible. They are, in the most literal sense, geological anomalies, structures that push against the limits of what we thought we understood about crystal growth. Mainstream science explains the crystals as the product of unusual but not impossible conditions. A stable temperature maintained for 500,000 years by the volcanic activity beneath the mountains, saturated groundwater that provided a continuous supply of dissolved minerals, and the absence of any disturbance that might have interrupted the slow, steady growth. The size is remarkable but not inexplicable, given sufficient time and stability. The beauty is accidental, a byproduct of physics and chemistry operating at scales that happen to exceed human experience. Yet certain biological discoveries within the chambers continue to challenge even this expanded understanding. In 2017, researchers announced the recovery of viable microorganisms from fluid inclusions within the crystals themselves, organisms that had apparently been trapped for tens of thousands of years and had survived somehow, in conditions that should have been incompatible with any known form of life. The crystals grew at temperatures near the upper limit of biological tolerance. The fluid pockets were tiny, isolated, devoid of the nutrients that conventional biology considers necessary for survival. Yet life persisted, life adapted, life found a way. The organisms recovered represent lineages previously unknown to science, related to but distinct from any catalogued species, suggesting evolution in isolation over geological timescales. Their survival challenges assumptions about the limits of biology, about the conditions necessary for life to persist, about what might be possible in environments we have dismissed as sterile. If life can survive for 50,000 years in a fluid pocket inside a crystal, in a superheated cave beneath a Mexican mountain, where else might life be waiting that we have not yet thought to look? The crystals themselves seem almost alive, in the loosest sense of the word. They grew. They responded to their environment. They achieve structures of remarkable complexity through processes that, while not biological, show certain formal similarities to biological growth. And now, drained of the water that sustained them, they are beginning to degrade, the exposure to air initiating a slow process of dissolution that will eventually reduce these geological cathedrals to dust. We arrived by accident just in time to see them, and our arrival has ensured their destruction. One cannot stand in the cave of the crystals sweating through the protective suit that makes brief visits possible, without feeling that the boundary between the living and the non-living is less absolute than we have assumed. The crystals grew, the microorganisms survived, the chamber itself maintained conditions that selected for certain outcomes and excluded others. Is this not, in some sense, a kind of life? Is this not, at some level, the Earth remembering how to make something beautiful, something unprecedented, something that persists against all odds? The knowledge required to form these crystals was not human knowledge. It was the knowledge of the Earth itself, encoded in temperature gradients and mineral concentrations and geological stability, maintained across 500,000 years. No human hand carved these chambers, no human mind designed these structures. And yet they stand as testimony to a kind of creativity, a kind of intention that transcends anything our species has achieved. The Earth, it seems, has its own arts. We are only beginning to learn how to see them, and so our journey pauses here, suspended between the painted caves of our distant ancestors and the crystal caves of the deep Earth, between the mysteries of human achievement and the mysteries of geological possibility. The surface world waits above, with its certainties and its daylight and its comfortable categories. But down here, in the darkness, those categories dissolve. The boundary between human and natural, between carved and grown, between living and non-living, becomes permeable, uncertain, open to question. What drove our ancestors into the deep places? What did they find there? What did they learn, and how did they lose it? Why do the same patterns appear across continents and millennia, as if something in the encounter between human consciousness and subterranean darkness produces consistent results? And what might still be waiting, in caves not yet discovered, in chambers not yet opened, in depths not yet reached? The questions multiply in the silence, the Earth keeps its secrets, and somewhere, far below the surface, the stone remembers what we have forgotten. The darkness that enfolds these underground realms carries with it a quality that defies precise description, a weight that is not merely physical but psychological, almost spiritual. To descend into the Earth is to leave behind not only sunlight but certainty itself, to enter spaces where the rules that govern the surface world seem to loosen, to blur, to sometimes disappear entirely, and as we have seen, across continents and millennia, human beings have been drawn to these places with a persistence that suggests something more than practical necessity, something that approaches compulsion, obsession, even reverence. The caves we have visited thus far represent only a fraction of the subterranean mysteries that dot our planet, only glimpses of a vast underground archive that remains largely unexplored, largely unmapped, largely uncomprehended. Yet even these glimpses reveal patterns that cannot be easily dismissed, parallels that demand explanation, enigmas that resist the neat categories we have constructed to make sense of our world. Consider for a moment the extraordinary technical achievements we have encountered. At Longyou, unknown craftsmen removed an estimated 1 million cubic meters of stone, using methods that left no recognizable tool marks, working to tolerances that modern engineers struggle to match. At Derinkuyu, builders carved 18 levels deep into volcanic rock, creating a city capable of sheltering tens of thousands of people for extended periods, complete with ventilation systems sophisticated enough to circulate fresh air through the entire complex. In the crystal caves of Naka, the Earth itself demonstrated a capacity for precision that rivals anything our species has produced, growing selenite crystals of impossible scale and perfection through processes we are only beginning to understand. In each case, we encounter achievement that seems to exceed the capabilities we have assigned to its creators. In each case, the official explanation, while not necessarily wrong, feels somehow incomplete, as if we are seeing only part of the picture, hearing only fragments of a longer story. And then there are the questions that the official explanations do not even attempt to address. Why did the builders of Longyou undertake a project of such enormous scale and difficulty, only to abandon it without apparent completion? Why does no historical record mention the excavation, even though such an undertaking would have required the coordinated labour of thousands of workers over generations? Why do the cave systems of Derinkuyu extend so much deeper than practical necessity would seem to require? And why do the lowest levels appear to have been sealed deliberately, as if their builders wanted to prevent access to something below? What drew our ancestors into caves like Chauvet and Sulawesi, where they created artwork of stunning sophistication in locations so remote and difficult to reach that the art itself could rarely have been seen? What knowledge allowed them to achieve acoustic effects that modern acoustic engineers recognise as intentional but cannot fully explain? And what precisely were the microorganisms in the nacre crystals doing during their 50,000 years of isolation, evolving in directions unknown, developing capabilities we cannot yet assess? These questions converge toward a hypothesis that mainstream science has been reluctant to entertain, but that the evidence increasingly supports, namely that the relationship between human beings and the underground world is far older, far deeper, and far more significant than we have assumed. That the caves we're only now exploring may have been known, visited, and utilised for purposes we can no longer fully reconstruct. That techniques and knowledge we consider modern discoveries may in fact be rediscoveries, recoveries of understanding that existed in some form in the distant past and was subsequently lost. The hypothesis cannot be proven with the evidence currently available, but neither can it be dismissed. The caves themselves seem to whisper it, in their strange acoustics and their stranger histories, in their carved walls and their painted galleries, in their persistent mysteries and their stubborn silences. Yet perhaps the most profound implication of our journey thus far concerns not what our ancestors knew, but what we do not know, not the mysteries of the past, but the mysteries of the present. For the caves we have visited represent only a tiny fraction of the subterranean world, only those spaces that accident or persistence has revealed to modern investigation. Beneath our feet, at this very moment, stretch vast networks of caverns and passages that have never been mapped, never been explored, never been entered by any human being. Some of these spaces may be empty, mere voids in the rock, geologically significant but historically irrelevant. But the pattern we have observed suggests otherwise. The pattern suggests that wherever caves exist, human beings have eventually found them, entered them, used them, left traces of their presence that can persist for tens of thousands of years. If this pattern holds, then the caves we have not yet discovered may contain evidence we have not yet imagined, artifacts we cannot yet interpret, knowledge we have not yet begun to suspect exists. The deep earth, it seems, is an archive, and we have only begun to open its pages. This brings us to consider what might be called the archaeology of absence, the attempt to understand what is missing from the record and why. Every civilization that has risen has eventually fallen. Every technology that has been developed has eventually been lost, sometimes recovered, sometimes not. We speak casually of the fall of Rome, the collapse of the Maya, the disappearance of the Indus Valley civilization, as if these events were anomalies, departures from a norm of steady progress. But the archaeological record tells a different story. The archaeological record suggests that collapse is the norm, that every complex society eventually fragments, that every accumulated body of knowledge eventually dissipates, scattered by war, eroded by time, forgotten in the chaos that follows the breakdown of the systems that maintained it. We are the heirs of countless losses, standing on a mountain of forgotten achievements, mistaking our limited recovery of ancient knowledge for the totality of what was once known. The underground world offers a unique perspective on this process because the underground world preserves what the surface world destroys. On the surface, buildings crumble, records burn, forests reclaim farmland, rivers shift their courses and bury entire cities under meters of sediment. But underground, in the stable temperatures and the persistent darkness of the deep caves, preservation extends across timescales that seem almost geological. The paintings of Chauvet have survived for 36,000 years, their pigments still vivid, their lines still precise. The carvings of Longyou remain sharp after more than 2,000 years of abandonment, the chisel marks as clear as if the workers had left yesterday. The microorganisms of nacre persisted for 50,000 years in conditions that should have killed them within months. Underground, time moves differently. Underground, the past is not so distant as it seems. and this raises a possibility that verges on the unsettling. If the underground world preserves what the surface world destroys, and if our ancestors understood this property and utilized it intentionally, then the caves we have not yet found may contain not just traces of the past, but deliberate messages to the future, archives created specifically to survive the collapses their creators anticipated, repositories of knowledge deemed too important to leave to the mercy of surface events, time capsules in effect, buried not in backyard ceremonies but in the deep places of the earth, waiting for future generations who might have the wisdom to find them, to open them, to understand what they contain. This possibility has been explored most dramatically in connection with a site we have not yet discussed in detail, a site that occupies a peculiar position in the landscape of underground mysteries. The Cueva de los Tallos, located in the southeastern jungles of Ecuador, has been the subject of extraordinary claims and bitter controversies for more than half a century. Named for the oil birds, or tallos, that nest within its chambers, the cave system extends for kilometers through the sedimentary rock of the Amazon basin, reaching depths that have not been fully mapped. Indigenous peoples of the region, particularly the Shuar, have known the cave for generations, considering it a sacred site, a place of power, a threshold between worlds. But to the outside world, the Cueva de los Tallos became significant in 1972, when an Ecuadorian researcher named Juan Morich claimed to have discovered something unprecedented within its depths. A metal library, thousands of metal tablets inscribed with symbols and images stored in a vast subterranean chamber, representing, in Morich's interpretation, the accumulated knowledge of a civilization that predated all known history. The claim was extraordinary. The evidence supporting it was and remains elusive. Morich offered photographs that were ambiguous at best, descriptions that varied in their details, accounts of his discovery that shifted under scrutiny. He refused to reveal the precise location of the alleged library, claiming that he had made promises to the Shuar that prevented him from doing so. Skeptics dismissed the entire affair as a hoax, a publicity stunt, a delusion born of jungle fever and too many readings of lost civilization literature, and yet the story refused to die. Other explorers reported encountering anomalous features within the cave system, massive blocks of stone that appeared to have been carved and fitted with precision that seemed inconsistent with natural formation, chambers with unusually regular geometries, acoustic properties that suggested intentional design rather than geological accident, and perhaps most significantly, the consistent testimony of the Shuar themselves, who spoke of the cave as a place where their ancestors had stored sacred objects, where knowledge was preserved against disaster, where the line between myth and memory blurred in ways that Western categories struggle to accommodate. In 1976, the cave attracted attention from an unexpected quarter. Neil Armstrong, the first human to walk on the moon, joined a major expedition to explore the Cueva de los Tallos, an expedition organised by the British military and supported by the Ecuadorian government. The expedition lasted several weeks and involved over 100 participants, including geologists, archaeologists, botanists, and specialists in various scientific disciplines. The official results were modest. The team explored and mapped portions of the cave system, documented the geological features they encountered, collected biological specimens, recorded the culture and beliefs of the local Shuar communities. They found no metal library. They encountered no definitive evidence of an advanced prehistoric civilization. And yet the expedition's very existence raises questions that the official reports do not fully answer. Why would a recently retired astronaut, one of the most famous people on the planet, devote weeks of his life to exploring a cave in the Ecuadorian jungle based on claims that most scientists dismissed as fantasy? Why would the British military commit significant resources to an expedition that, according to the official account, was primarily scientific in nature? What did the organisers expect to find? And what precisely did they actually discover? The answers, if they exist, remain classified or simply unrecorded. Armstrong himself rarely discussed the expedition in subsequent years, offering only cryptic comments when pressed. The expedition's detailed findings have never been fully published. And the Cueva de los Tallos continues to attract explorers and researchers, each new expedition adding fragments to a picture that never quite resolves into clarity. Some investigators have focused on the cave's acoustic properties, noting that certain chambers produce resonances that seem too regular, too precise to be entirely natural. sound within these spaces behaves strangely, travelling in unexpected directions, amplifying in unexpected ways, creating effects that suggest the chambers may have been designed or modified to achieve specific sonic outcomes. Similar observations have been made at other sacred sites around the world, from the underground chambers beneath the Hypogeum of Malta to the passage tombs of Ireland, from the Cuevas of the American Southwest to the meditation caves of the Himalayas. The pattern suggests intentionality. The pattern suggests knowledge. The pattern suggests that our ancestors understood something about the relationship between sound and space, between vibration and consciousness, that we have largely forgotten. Other researchers have focused on the cave's alleged metal tablets, attempting to locate the chamber that Moritz described, or to find evidence that such a chamber might exist. The results have been inconclusive. Portions of the cave system remain unexplored, their access blocked by rockfalls or flooded passages or the sheer difficulty of the terrain. The Shuar, whose traditional territory includes the cave, have been selective in what they reveal to outsiders, sharing some knowledge while withholding other information for reasons they consider sufficient but do not always explain. The possibility that the metal library exists, hidden in some undiscovered chamber, cannot be definitively ruled out, but neither can it be confirmed. The mystery persists, suspended between belief and skepticism, between the extraordinary claims of its proponents and the reasonable doubts of its critics. What can be said with certainty is that the Cueva de los Tallos represents something significant, even if we cannot agree on what that significance is. The cave is genuinely impressive, extending for at least 4 kilometers through the rock, reaching depths of over 200 meters, containing chambers of remarkable scale and complexity. Its relationship with the Shuar people is genuinely ancient, documented in oral traditions that predate European contact by generations or centuries, and its effect on those who enter it is genuinely powerful, producing experiences of disorientation, wonder, even fear that multiple explorers have independently reported. The cave does something to human consciousness. It shifts perception. It loosens the grip of ordinary categories. It invites speculation, even demands it, as if the darkness itself were asking questions that the daylight world is too distracted to hear. Perhaps this is the metal library's true significance, regardless of whether it physically exists. The Cueva de los Tallos functions as a repository of a different kind, storing not inscribed tablets but possibilities, preserving not recorded knowledge but the conditions that make knowledge possible. To enter the cave is to encounter the unknown in its purest form, to stand at the boundary between what we know and what we have yet to discover, to feel the weight of questions that may never be answered. The cave does not resolve mysteries, it generates them. It reminds us that the world is larger than our maps, deeper than our measurements, stranger than our explanations can accommodate. And in this sense, the Cueva de los Tallos delivers exactly what its legend promises. A library, yes, but a library written in darkness and silence, in possibility and uncertainty, in the irreducible mystery of the earth itself. The jungle above the cave presses close, thick with life, loud with birdsong and insect hum, and the constant drip of moisture from leaf to leaf. The canopy blocks most of the sky, creating a permanent green twilight that makes the actual darkness of the cave seem less foreign, more like an intensification of conditions that already prevail. The Shuar, who have lived here for centuries or millennia, understand the forest and the cave as continuous, as two aspects of a single living system. The green world above and the dark world below intertwined in relationships that Western categories struggle to capture. They speak of the cave not as a dead space, a mere void in the rock, but as a living presence, a being with intentions and moods and memories. They approach it with respect, with ceremony, with awareness that what happens underground has consequences above, and what happens above has consequences below. This is not, for them, metaphor. It is observation, accumulated across generations, tested against experience, refined into understanding that we dismiss as superstition because we lack the framework to recognize it as science. And perhaps this is the deepest mystery of all, not the caves themselves, but our relationship to them. Not the questions we ask, but the questions we fail to ask. Not what we have found, but what we have overlooked. The underground world offers lessons that the surface world tends to obscure. Lessons about time, which moves differently in the deep places, where thousands of years leave only subtle traces and the present moment stretches toward eternity. lessons about perspective, which shifts in the absence of horizons, where the familiar categories of up and down, near and far, large and small become negotiable, uncertain, subject to revision. Lessons about knowledge itself, which proves to be not a commodity that accumulates, but a flame that must be tended, that can be extinguished by carelessness or catastrophe, that may burn brighter in some ages and dimmer in others according to conditions we do not fully control. The caves remember what we forget. They preserve what we destroy. They whisper what we no longer know how to hear, and they wait, patient as stone, for us to descend once more into the darkness, to ask the questions that only darkness can answer, to learn what only silence can teach. The surface world continues its busy rotations, its cycles of construction and destruction, its confident assertions and its inevitable collapses. But underground, in the vast quiet of the deep places, time moves to a different rhythm, one measured not in years or centuries but in millennia, in geological epochs, in spans that make our entire recorded history seem like a single breath, a momentary flicker, a brief and almost imperceptible stirring in the eternal stillness. What would we find if we could read that stillness? What would we learn if we could hear that silence? What would we understand if we could descend not merely into the physical depths of the earth, but into the depths of our own ignorance, acknowledging what we do not know, accepting what we may never understand, embracing the mystery rather than trying to resolve it? The caves do not answer these questions. They are the questions given form in stone and darkness, carved into the rock by forces we can name but not fully comprehend. They are the spaces where certainty dissolves, where categories blur, where the boundary between the known and the unknown becomes permeable, fluid, open to revision, and they are still there, waiting. Beneath the painted hills of France and the limestone plateaus of Sulawesi, beneath the villages of China and the cities of Turkey, beneath the jungles of Ecuador and the mountains of Mexico, the caves wait. Some have been found, some have been explored, some have given up a portion of their secrets to persistent investigation. But countless others remain undiscovered, their entrances hidden by vegetation, or rockfall, or simple oversight, their chambers untouched by human presence for thousands or tens of thousands of years. What might they contain? What might they reveal? What knowledge might be waiting there, preserved across ages, protected from the catastrophes that have erased so much else from the record? The questions echo in the darkness, unanswered, unanswerable, persistent as stone, and somewhere, far below the surface, the earth keeps its secrets still. Yet even as we contemplate the secrets that remain hidden, we must return our attention to what has already emerged from the depths, to the patterns that connect these disparate sites across continents and millennia, to the questions that grow more insistent the longer we consider them. For what began as individual anomalies, isolated curiosities that might be explained away as statistical outliers or misinterpretations of evidence, has now accumulated into something more substantial, more coherent, more demanding of serious consideration. The caves of Chauvet and Sulawesi, separated by half a world, share artistic sophistication that conventional timelines struggle to accommodate. The caverns of Longyou and the underground cities of Cappadocia, carved by unknown hands for unknown purposes, demonstrate engineering capabilities that exceed what we typically attribute to their supposed eras. The Cueva de los Tallos hints at knowledge systems that operated outside the documentary traditions we consider necessary for advanced civilization, and the crystal chambers of Naka reveal that even our understanding of life itself, of what constitutes survivable conditions and how organisms persist across time, remains incomplete, provisional, subject to revision in the face of evidence we did not anticipate. These are not minor corrections to existing paradigms. They are not the kind of incremental refinements that science typically embraces, the small adjustments that bring theory into closer alignment with observation without disturbing fundamental assumptions. They are instead challenges to the very categories we use to organize the human past, to the timeline that serves as the backbone of archaeological understanding, to the relationship we assume between technological capability and chronological position. And the deeper we descend into the evidence, the more substantial these challenges become. The painted animals of Chauvet do not merely suggest that Paleolithic humans could create art. They suggest that these humans, living more than 30,000 years ago, possessed observational skills, manual dexterity, and conceptual sophistication that rival or exceed anything produced in the intervening millennia. The perspective techniques, the attention to anatomical detail, the apparent understanding of how animals move through space and time, these are not primitive gestures toward representation. They are achievements that would be remarkable in any era, that continue to influence and inspire contemporary artists, that reveal a depth of consciousness and capability that our standard narratives have difficulty accommodating. Consider what we must believe if we accept the conventional explanation. We must believe that humans achieved this level of artistic mastery at the very beginning of their creative journey, that the earliest surviving artworks are also among the most accomplished, that the subsequent 30,000 years represent not progress but in many ways decline or at best stasis. We must believe that the same species that produced Chauvet then spent millennia producing cruder, simpler images, before eventually recovering some of this early sophistication. We must believe, in essence, that artistic skill appeared fully formed, like Athena sprung from the head of Zeus, without the gradual development that evolutionary models would predict. The standard response to this paradox involves the convenient assumption that earlier art simply did not survive, that Chauvet represents not a beginning but a middle or even a late point in an artistic tradition that stretches back far further than we can document. This is plausible, it may even be correct. But notice what it requires us to accept, that human artistic achievement extends much further into the past than we have evidence for, that our timeline of cultural development is not wrong but radically incomplete, that the capabilities we find surprising at 30,000 years may have existed for 50,000, for 100,000, for longer still. The mystery does not resolve, it deepens, and what applies to art applies equally to engineering. The Longyou caverns present us with an excavation project of almost inconceivable scale, carved with precision that suggests not primitive trial and error, but sophisticated planning, standardized techniques, accumulated expertise. The conventional explanation attributes this work to the 2nd century BC, to a period when such capabilities were certainly possible, but when such an undertaking would have represented an enormous commitment of resources and labour. Yet no record survives, no inscription commemorates the achievement, no legend preserves the names of those who conceived and executed this vast enterprise. The caves exist as if they emerged from nothing, as if they always existed, as if they carved themselves from the living rock and merely awaited human discovery. This silence is itself significant, itself a kind of evidence that we have learned to overlook, for we assume that major undertakings leave documentary traces, that ambitious rulers and engineers seek recognition for their accomplishments, that human vanity, if nothing else, ensures that great works are associated with great names. The pyramids proclaim their builders, the aqueducts of Rome carry inscriptions, even modest construction projects in the ancient world often bear the marks of their patrons, their architects, their dedicatees. But Longyou is anonymous, attributable to no dynasty, no emperor, no military campaign or religious movement. It exists outside history, in a space where documentation either failed to occur or failed to survive, where memory proved insufficient to preserve what stone preserved effortlessly. The same pattern repeats at Derinkuyu and throughout the underground cities of Cappadocia. Here, the conventional explanation offers the Phrygians as possible originators, with later expansion by Byzantine Christians fleeing persecution. This is not unreasonable. The Phrygians were skilled builders. The region's soft volcanic rock lends itself to excavation. Religious minorities throughout history have sought refuge in remote or concealed locations, and the underground cities would have offered substantial protection against raiders and armies that could not easily follow their quarry into the labyrinthine depths. Yet the scale of these installations, the sophistication of their ventilation systems, the massive stone doors that could seal passages against invasion, the ability to support thousands of people for extended periods, these suggest capabilities that exceed what we typically attribute to desperate refugees, or even to prosperous but technologically limited ancient peoples. The engineering challenges alone are formidable. Carving multiple levels deep into the rock without causing collapse requires understanding of load distribution and structural stability. Creating ventilation shafts that reach the surface from more than 80 meters below, while maintaining air circulation throughout a complex three-dimensional network, requires understanding of fluid dynamics and practical experience with airflow in enclosed spaces, designing systems that could sustain human life for months without access to the surface requires planning, calculation, anticipation of needs, and contingencies that we associate with modern engineering rather than ancient improvisation. And once again, the documentation fails. We do not know who first conceived these underground cities. We do not know how long the carving took, how many workers were involved, what methods they employed, what drove them to undertake such labour. We do not know whether they considered their work sacred or mundane, a desperate necessity or a deliberate choice, a temporary refuge or a permanent habitation. The rock remembers the cutting. The passages remember the footsteps. But the stories, the reasons, the human context that would transform archaeology into history, these have vanished as completely as if they never existed, as if the underground cities grew organically from the earth itself, requiring no human explanation because they preceded human memory. This pattern of anonymous achievement, of capability without documentation, of sophisticated works that appear from nowhere and are attributed to no one, appears again and again in the underground sites we have explored. It appears in the acoustic properties of painted caves, suggesting deliberate placement of art in resonant chambers for reasons we can only guess. It appears in the astronomical alignments that some researchers claim to detect in cave orientations and passages, alignments that would require knowledge of celestial mechanics, attributed to much later periods. It appears in the persistent legends of metal libraries and lost archives, of knowledge preserved underground because it was too valuable or too dangerous to leave exposed to the vicissitudes of the surface world. And it appears most dramatically in sites like Nika, where the very conditions necessary to produce the geological wonders we observe also make human habitation virtually impossible, yet where evidence of life persists nonetheless, in forms and timescales that challenge our understanding of what survival means. The crystals of Nika grew across hundreds of thousands of years, layer upon layer of gypsum accumulated in water, heated by volcanic activity far below. They grew in darkness, in temperatures that would kill an unprotected human within minutes, in humidity that approaches complete saturation. Nothing about their environment suggests hospitality to life. Everything about their environment suggests lethality, sterility, the absence of conditions that biology requires. Yet the microorganisms discovered within their crystal lattices tell a different story. A story of adaptation and survival that spans geological time. A story that suggests life finds ways to persist even in conditions that seem absolutely prohibitive. These organisms were not merely present in the caves. They were trapped within the crystals themselves, enclosed in fluid inclusions as the gypsum precipitated around them, preserved in a state of suspended animation that may have lasted 50,000 years or longer. When researchers extracted and cultured them, they revived. They resumed metabolic activity. They demonstrated that the boundary between life and death, between active existence and indefinite dormancy, is far more permeable than we had assumed. What does this mean for our understanding of life itself? What does it mean for our assumptions about what is possible and what is impossible? What conditions life can tolerate and what conditions it cannot? How long biological information can persist and under what circumstances? The conventional wisdom holds that life requires specific conditions, that it operates within defined parameters of temperature and pressure and chemical availability, that it cannot survive for extended periods without access to energy and nutrients. The organisms of Nika challenge this wisdom without necessarily overturning it. They suggest that life is more resourceful than we knew, more adaptable, more persistent. They suggest that our understanding of the boundary between living and non-living, between possible and impossible environments, requires revision. And they suggest, perhaps most provocatively, that similar organisms might exist elsewhere, in environments we have dismissed as lifeless because they exceed the parameters we considered necessary, in the subsurface oceans of ice moons, in the dry ancient lakes of Mars, in the countless other locations throughout the cosmos where conditions are hostile but not necessarily prohibitive. But here we move from the specific to the speculative, from what the caves have revealed to what they might imply. And it is in this movement, in this transition from evidence to interpretation, that the deepest mysteries emerge. For the caves themselves are not mysterious. They are rock and water, darkness and silence, physical features that can be measured and mapped and analysed according to standard scientific methods. The mystery lies not in what the caves are, but in what they contain, not in their physical structure, but in the traces of human activity they preserve, not in the evidence, but in the questions the evidence provokes. And the greatest of these questions, the one that echoes through every site we have visited, concerns not the caves or their contents, but ourselves, not the past, but our relationship to it, not what happened, but what we have forgotten. The timeline of human history, as conventionally constructed, begins approximately 5,000 years ago with the emergence of writing in Mesopotamia. Before this point lies prehistory, a vast span of time during which humans lived and worked and created but left no documentary record, no way for us to recover their thoughts and intentions except through the material traces that happened to survive. The caves we have explored extend this prehistory far beyond what most people imagine. Back beyond the last ice age, back beyond the emergence of anatomically modern humans in their current form, back into depths of time that render all recorded history a mere postscript, a footnote, a brief addendum to a story that began long before anyone thought to write it down. Chauvet dates to more than 30,000 years ago. Sulawesi pushes creative activity back 45,000 years and perhaps further. The crystal organisms of Naka may have lived tens of thousands of years before any human ever entered their chamber. These are not spans that human intuition can easily grasp. They exceed the scope of memory, of legend, of any oral tradition that might preserve continuous connection to the past. They represent true discontinuity, gaps in knowledge that cannot be filled by asking elders or consulting archives, that can only be addressed through the patient reconstruction of physical evidence. And here we encounter the central paradox that unites all these underground sites. The evidence suggests that human capability, human creativity, human ingenuity may extend far further into the past than our standard narratives accommodate. The evidence suggests that sophisticated understanding of acoustics, of pigment chemistry, of engineering principles, of astronomical patterns may have existed in periods we typically characterize as primitive or pre-civilized. The evidence suggests that the progress model of history, in which capabilities steadily accumulate and each generation exceeds its predecessors, may not apply to all domains, that some knowledge may have peaked early and declined later, that some capabilities may have been lost rather than built upon. But this same evidence also suggests something more uncomfortable, something that challenges not merely our timeline but our self-conception, our sense of where we stand in the arc of human development. It suggests that we may have forgotten more than we remember, that our current knowledge may represent not a peak but a recovery, that the confident modernity we celebrate may be built on foundations we no longer recognize. The caves know this. The caves remember what we have lost. They preserve traces of activity that exceed our expectations, evidence of capability that challenges our assumptions, hints of understanding that we are only now beginning to recover. They show us that the people who painted in darkness, who carved in silence, who built entire cities beneath the earth, were not primitive precursors struggling toward the enlightenment we now enjoy, but accomplished practitioners of arts and sciences. We have largely forgotten, working within frameworks of understanding that we dismiss because we do not share them, achieving results that we find difficult to replicate because we have lost the knowledge that made them possible. This is not a comfortable conclusion. It does not flatter our sense of progress, our assumption that we know more than our ancestors, our confidence that technology moves in one direction only, from less to more, from crude to sophisticated, from darkness to light. But the caves do not exist to comfort us. They exist as records, as archives, as repositories of truth that the surface world has obscured, and their message, when we finally learn to read it, may be that we are not the culmination of human development, but merely its latest iteration, no more final than any that preceded us, no more permanent than the painted animals that have already outlasted everything our civilization has built. Standing at the threshold of any of these caves, at the boundary between the familiar world of sunlight and the alien world of subterranean darkness, one feels this truth in the body before the mind can formulate it. The air changes, the sounds change, the very quality of space changes, becoming denser, more charged, more pregnant with possibility. This is the liminal zone that our ancestors recognized as sacred, the transitional space where categories dissolve and new understanding becomes possible. They marked these thresholds with symbols and rituals, with ceremonies of preparation and purification, with acknowledgement that what happens in the depths is different from what happens in the light. They understood, in ways we have largely forgotten, that the underground world is not merely an extension of the surface world but its counterpart, its complement, its shadow. They understood that to descend is not merely to go down but to go elsewhere, to enter a different mode of being, to encounter truths that cannot be accessed by other means. And they preserved their most important knowledge in these places, encoded in images and structures that have survived everything the surface world has thrown at them, waiting for interpreters who may not yet have appeared, speaking in languages we may not yet know how to hear. What do the caves want to tell us? What message have they been holding across all these millennia, protected from the catastrophes that have erased so much else, preserved in darkness and silence until someone comes to receive it? We cannot answer these questions with certainty. We can only note that the questions exist, that they persist, that they grow more urgent as our own civilization demonstrates its capacity for self-destruction, its talent for forgetting, its inclination to build impressive structures and then walk away from them, leaving only ruins for future archaeologists to puzzle over. The caves of Chauvet and Sulawesi have already outlasted every empire that has risen and fallen since their creation. The underground cities of Cappadocia have sheltered refugees from disasters that seemed absolute at the time and are now barely remembered. The crystals of nacre were growing when our ancestors first left Africa, and they will still be growing long after our current civilization has joined all the others in the archaeological record. Perhaps this is the lesson. Perhaps this is what the caves have been trying to teach us all along, that what seems permanent is temporary, that what seems solid dissolves, that the surface world for all its brightness and activity is the ephemeral realm, while the underground world for all its darkness and silence is where duration lives. The descent into the earth is also a descent into time, into the deep past that we carry within us but rarely access, into the accumulated experience of our species across spans that dwarf individual memory. The caves preserve this time. They hold it in trust, waiting for us to come and claim it, waiting for us to remember what we have forgotten, to recognize what we have overlooked, to receive the inheritance that our ancestors left for us in the only places where it could survive. And they will continue waiting. They have already waited longer than our entire recorded history. They can wait longer still. The question is not whether the caves will endure. The question is whether we will learn to hear what they're saying, whether we will develop the humility to acknowledge what we do not know, whether we will find the courage to descend into the darkness and confront the mysteries that wait there, patient as stone, silent as the space between stars, enduring as the earth itself. The painted animals still run across the walls of Chauvet, caught in eternal motion, preserved beyond the reach of time. The carved chambers of Longyou still echo with questions we cannot answer, emptiness shaped by vanished hands for vanished purposes. The ventilation shafts of Derinkuyu still draw air from the surface to the depths, engineering marvels that function after millennia of neglect. The legends of the Tayos still circulate among those who know how to listen, stories of metal books and star visitors that may be fantasy or may be memory, fragments of truth preserved in forms we have forgotten how to recognize. And the crystals of nacre still grow in their impossible chambers, indifferent to human presence, indifferent to human absence, following laws that operated before humans existed and will continue operating after we are gone. These are the underground archives of our species. These are the repositories of knowledge that survived when everything else perished. These are the places where time moves slowly enough for truth to accumulate, where darkness deep enough to preserve what light would destroy, where silence profound enough to hold messages that noise would drown. They do not ask for our belief. They do not require our understanding. They simply exist, as they have existed for millennia beyond count, as they will exist for millennia to come. And their existence is itself the message, the teaching, the lesson we have travelled into darkness to receive, that the earth remembers, that the stone preserves, that the deep places hold what the surface world forgets, and that somewhere, in chambers not yet discovered, in passages not yet explored, in depths not yet reached, the answers wait, patient as crystal growth, silent as the space before creation, eternal as the darkness that was here before any light was kindled and will be here after the last light fails. The journey ends, as all journeys must, at the place where it began, not at any particular cave but at the threshold, at the boundary between the world we know and the world we have only glimpsed, between the questions we can ask and the questions we have not yet learned to formulate. The caves remain. They have always remained. They will continue to remain long after the last trace of our presence has dissolved into the sediment, long after our languages have been forgotten and our civilizations have joined the anonymous dust of ages. And in their remaining, in their patient persistence across time spans that render human history a brief and almost imperceptible flicker, they speak to something in us that we do not have words for, something older than language, older than art, older perhaps than consciousness itself. We came from darkness. We will return to darkness. And in the interval of light that constitutes our existence, we have the opportunity to descend, to explore, to wonder, to ask the questions that only the underground places can answer. The caves are waiting. They have been waiting for 30,000 years. They can wait a little longer. But the question they pose, the question that echoes through every painted gallery and carved chamber and crystal cavern we have visited, is whether we will come to them before we have forgotten how to listen, before we have lost the capacity to hear what silence says, before we have built so much noise around ourselves that the deep places cannot reach us anymore. What knowledge lies buried that we have not yet uncovered? What capabilities did our ancestors possess that we have not yet recovered? What understanding of the earth, of time, of ourselves, awaits us in the darkness if only we are willing to descend? The caves do not answer. They never answer. They only wait, holding their secrets in stone and silence, preserving what can be preserved, offering what can be offered, existing in their timeless patience as invitation and challenge and promise, asking nothing but our presence, demanding nothing but our attention, revealing nothing but what we are ready to receive. And somewhere, far below the surface of the world we know, in chambers that no light has ever touched and no sound has ever disturbed, the deep places hold their breath, waiting for the footsteps that will one day come, the questions that will one day be asked, the understanding that will one day, perhaps, finally emerge from the darkness into which we must descend to find it.